actually in chapter 6. We have one more lesson in chapter 6 tomorrow. Then we're going to spend 2 whole days reviewing because this has been a super, super, super long chapter. So we started this chapter with multiplying decimals, and then we are ending this chapter with dividing decimals. So on your test on Friday, you're going to see both of those things. We're going to be talking about dividing decimals and multiplying decimals on the test. So tomorrow's another division lesson. There's a few different ways. Remember yesterday last week, whenever I told you how when you're dividing decimals, there's a few different ways that you can see the problems. So on Thursday last week, we did a lesson where there was decimals underneath the bar. So the decimals were the dividend, and then the outside number was a whole number. So all we had to do was take the decimal and bump it up into the answer. Today's lesson, we have decimals in both places. So we have a decimal on the outside of the bar as a divisor, and we have a decimal underneath the bar as a dividend. So we have 2 decimal points. So there are some different tricks on finding where that decimal point goes when you have decimals in both spots. So last time it was easy because all we did was bump the decimal from the underneath the bar into the quotient, and today we're going to have to do some different tricks. And so that's what this lesson is about. And then tomorrow we're going to have one more division lesson, which is where you have a decimal on the outside of the bar but not the inside. And then we'll have done all 3 types. Okay? So we're still working on the same essential question, talking about how multiplying and dividing decimals is similar to multiplying and dividing whole numbers. And you've seen, now that we're almost done with this chapter, how similar it is. The division is just like dividing regular numbers. You kind of ignore the decimal point until you need to figure out where you're going to put it. So that just adds one more step to your problem where we have to figure out where the decimal point goes. But the other parts are the same. We're going to skip that one for today. We have too many examples here to do. So in your notes, you need to write divide decimals. That's the title of the lesson. And the number is chapter 6, lesson 13. Chapter 6, lesson 13. You need to come out this way so you can see notes, okay? Not yet. You can. Yeah, until it's time to go. Okay, here's your first example. Pay very close attention. If I have 2 4/10 and I'm dividing that number by 3/10, do you see how this question looks a little bit different than what we did last time? So last time when we were dividing with decimals, only the number underneath the bar had a decimal point and the number outside the bar was a whole number. This time, both of those numbers have decimal points. That's what makes this lesson a little bit different. So here's what we do to solve this. First, we're going to move our decimal point. First, we're going to move the decimal point. This decimal that's on the outside of the bar here, I'll highlight it with green. This one, this is the number that this decimal point is going to tell you how many places you're going to move the other decimal point, because they have to both be moved the same number of times. That part's important. They have to both be moved the same number of times. If you move both decimal points, which basically what we're going to be doing is multiplying both of those numbers by a power of 10. Once we do that, as long as we multiply them both and we move both decimal points, then your answer will still be the same. If you only move one of them, you've changed the value of the numbers then, and then your answer will not be correct. So here's what I mean. We have a decimal point right here. I'm going to scoot it once to get it to the end of that number. For this example, I had to scoot it once. Sometimes you might have to scoot it twice. Depends on how many numbers are after that decimal point. But here I only scooted it once. So if I scoot that decimal once, that means I have to scoot this decimal once. And now my decimal point is here. And now this is really just like a 3. So if I rewrote my problem over here, this is now what I'm dividing. Because I made the number outside the bar into a whole number by scooting the decimal to the end. So I scoot the decimal to the end of the number so that I can make it a whole number. Then the number underneath the bar, the decimal point gets scooted the same number of places. And in this case, it's made both of those numbers a whole number. So now I'm dividing 3 into 2, which doesn't fit. 3 into 24 fits 8 times. 8 times 3 is 24. And my decimal point goes here, which is really just like 8 as my final answer. Yes, your final answer is just 8. You don't put the 0 in front of it, and you don't need the decimal in the back of it because there's no other numbers after.
Okay, you just made that really easy.
Oh, I'm glad.
I see.
So wait, hold on. Let me tell you something. Not every one of these is going to come out as a whole number. Sometimes, once you move this decimal,
I see why.
if I move, let's say I had another number here, like this was a 5 or something after that, then when I scooted it and I bumped it up, I would still have another number to bring down, and then you might have a decimal as your answer. Okay, so basically, I want to tell you the math behind what we're doing here. What you have to remember is you scoot the decimal point the same number of places in both numbers. Let me tell you the math behind it. You asked me why. Here's the why. I've multiplied 3/10, this number right here, by 10. Anthony, you asked me why. Look at the screen. I multiplied 3/10 by 10. Remember, every time you multiply a number by 10, you scoot the decimal once? And so because I multiplied that number by 10, I also have to multiply that number by 10. And when I do that, it gives you the same answer. So
the decimal's always going to be the same.
nope. That's exactly the opposite of what I just said. I said that sometimes the decimal is not always going to be at the end, and you're not going to have a whole number as here's an example of that.
How did you get the same answer though?
You don't get the same answer. You get the same answer as you would if you, like, say you had a calculator and you divided 2 4/10 divided by 3/10, it equals 8. It equals 8.
Yeah, but what I'm
But
trying to say
because if you do one thing to one of the numbers and you do the same thing to the other number, you will get the same answer. As long as you do the same thing to both of the numbers. It only works with decimals. It's not going to work with a whole number. If you put a 0 on the end of 2 whole numbers, it's not going to work with a whole number. It works with a decimal. Okay, so here's an example, Anthony, when I said that it's not always going to be a whole number. So here's your example. 1 5/10 as our divisor. Our dividend is 7 65/100. So I'm going to, now, here's where this is what part you have to remember. Remember how many times I've done this with kids your age. And I'm trying to reiterate the things that people do wrong every time so that you don't do that. You don't always move it once. It's not always once. The number out here, the decimal point out here, is going to tell you how many times to scoot it. So you check the number outside the bar first. This case, it's once, because this decimal has to go one time, and then it's at the end of that number, and now it's a 15. Because I scooted the outside decimal once, I have to scoot the inside decimal once. So I'm going to take that decimal and I'm going to scoot it once. Now it's here, and I bump it up into the answer. Okay, in the first example, when I scooted it down, it actually became at the end of the number because of the number of digits that were in that number. This one, I took my decimal and I scooted it down once here. I'm basically making that a whole number. We don't like dividing a decimal by a decimal. So what we do to fix it is we make it a whole number. So if you have to move it once, move it once. If you have to move it twice, move it twice. If you have to move it 3 times, move it 3 times. But whatever you do to this number, you have to do the same thing to this number. So I move that once. So I take this decimal and I move it once. Then I bump it up into the answer. Okay? Now I can divide. So now my question is really kind of just looks like this. Because now that I've moved my decimal points, it's like I'm dividing that number now. Because I scooted both of the decimal points down a little bit. So if I'm dividing 15 into 7, it doesn't fit. 15 into 76. We would have to do some guess and check. Nolan, what's your guess? How many times?
My guess will be, because I know that 25 goes into 76 3 times.
Mhm.
So I think it'll be like check 5.
Okay, so did you see what his thinking was on the guess and check? It's not just a random number, but he knew that a number close to 15 was 25, and that would go into 75 3 times. So he thought, well, it's got to be more than 3. So 5's a good guess. Let's try 5. That's 25. 5 times 1 is 5 plus 2 more is 7, so that's 75. Good guess, right? That's as close as you can get. So if you guess, I heard somebody say I guessed 7. If you guessed 7, then you would see that you just needed to lower your guess a little bit. That's what guess and check is about. So 6 minus 5 is 1. Bring down the 5, because remember, we're just doing long division here. 15 goes into 15 once. 1 times 15 is 15. So my answer is 5 and 1/10. If I put this, is that the same thing? No. If I put this, is that the same thing?
No.
You have to have the decimal in between the two numbers. And so this is the thing that a lot of kids do wrong. So I want you to look up at the screen for a second because I don't want you to do this. A lot of times kids will scoot this first decimal down once, and then they'll forget to scoot this one, and they'll bump it up, and then they'll get 0.51 as their answer. It's close because the numbers are right, but being that the decimal's in the wrong place, it changes the value of the number. Okay, so the difference is like this number here is kind of like $5.10 because if you put a 0 on the end, it would make it $5.10. And if you put the decimal in front, it's like 51 cents. Okay, so there's a difference between those two values. So you can't just get the numbers right but have the decimal in the wrong spot. So the decimal is super important here. You have to make sure that it's in the right place. Let's do another example. Yes, now you can. Ooh, check this one. Show me on your hand. Show me on your hand how many times you will scoot the decimal point.
0.
Show me on your hand how many times will you scoot the decimal point. I saw some people with right answers that just changed them. How many, Catherine, how many times will you scoot the decimal point?
Twice.
Why did you pick twice?
Because it has to get to the end of the number.
Has to get to the end of the number. Don't change your answer, guys. You guys all had the right answer, and because he told you, you guys all changed it. 2. 1, 2. Has to get to the end of the number. The number on the outside of the bar, right? That's what we're looking at. It has to get to the number on the outside of the bar.
It's just 5.
However many times you move that decimal, you move the one underneath the bar. So if I moved, good. So
What you fill the empty space?
so if I moved the outside number twice, Aiden, what did you just say? He said annex the 0. He's right. Right here, you would put a 0 in that space you've created. So I moved it twice, and this one I moved twice, and I just swooped it right up into the answer. Because I know my decimal is going to now go after that number.
10.
So now I'm dividing 5 into 0, which obviously doesn't fit. 5 doesn't fit into 1. How many times does 5 fit into 10?
I don't know.
2.
22.
2 times 5 is 10. Subtract it and get 0. So my final answer is just 2. It's not 002, or it's not 002 decimal. It's just 2. So I want you to write, I'm going to write a little, something I want you to have in your notes. I'm going to write it with a star, and I want you to copy it into your notes, okay? It's important for you to remember. You might think, I got it, but once you get home, or once we start studying for a test or something, I don't want you to forget. So I want you to write all this down. Okay, so it says, one more time, and then I'm erasing so that make sure you have this copied. Move the decimal to the end of the divisor, which is the number on the outside. Then move the decimal in the dividend, which is on the inside, the same number of times. Here's your last example that I want you to try this one by yourself. 8/100 dividing into 18 and 4/10. Try that one. I want you to try this one by yourself. You've worked it out on your paper? Shh. Now I want you to check up here as I'm solving this one. While I walked around and I saw some people's papers, I saw a few people who tried to do all of this swooping in their head. Please don't do that. It's just, you're just asking for making a mistake. Take the 2 seconds to write the problem the way it's written first. So on your assignment today, if you are using a piece of scratch paper, because we are doing long division and sometimes the scratch paper is easier than using the little square they give you. So take the second to write the problem exactly how it's written and then actually swoop the decimal point. Some people I saw were trying to do it in their heads. And you know what? You might be right 90% of the time. But it's that little tiny percent that you might get wrong. You don't want to make any mistakes on something like that. So then the little 0.1% that you get wrong, you would not want to get wrong because you tried to do something in your head that could have been done in 2 seconds. So watch. I take this decimal and I move it twice. So I'm going to take this decimal and I'm going to move it twice. And now I've created a space for an annex of a 0. Now I start to divide. So some people want to rewrite the problem after they do all of that. You can if you want to. You can rewrite the problem next to it or underneath like I showed you in a couple of other examples so that you don't have all the lines drawn there. Basically remember, you finished with your conversation? Yeah. Need to be finished with your conversation. There can only be one decimal point in a number at a time. Some people forget that too. And they think that they scooted it down here, but then they also leave it right here, and then they put 2 decimals or something crazy like that. Don't do that. Only one decimal point in a number. So now I'm dividing 8 into 1, which doesn't fit. 8 into 18 fits twice. That equals 16. When you subtract, you get 2. Bring down the 4. 8 goes into 24 3 times. 3 times 8 is 24. Subtract and get 0. Don't forget about this 0. 8 goes into 0 0 times. So then your final answer is 230. So 3, 2, 1, 0. On your test on Friday, you'll see a couple of other answers. Like if this were a question, they would definitely put 23 as an answer choice, just in case you forgot to annex a 0. They would definitely put 2 and 3/10 in case you forgot to scoot the decimal and you just bumped it up into the answer. And then they'd probably put something that's totally different. So these are all different numbers, right? They have the same digits, but they all are different values. So you have to make sure you're really paying attention to that decimal. I can't say that enough. It's super important. Okay, look over at your work page, example number 1. Give you about 10 seconds to make sure you're with me on this page. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Example number 1 says, Casey is 4 5/10 feet tall. Her brother Jerome is 6 7/75 feet tall. How many times taller is Jerome than Casey? So this is a division question. So I'm dividing 4 5/10 into 6 7/75. So over here, step number 1, do you see this right here? This is what I was explaining to you earlier when I said this is what you do, this is the trick that you scoot the decimal, but here's what you're doing. What you're doing is you're multiplying it by 10. Or by 100 if you're moving it twice. On this question, you're multiplying it by 10 because you're moving it once. So you're moving the decimal once in 4 5/10 to make it a 45, and then you're moving the decimal once in 6 7/75 to make it 67 5/10. So now you have this problem right here after you've moved all the decimal points. Okay? I have a little delay here on my screen, but I've pointed to something. You'll see it in a second. So now you can see so the decimal was here and the decimal was here, and they swooped it over once here and once here, but they already did that work for you. So now your decimal goes up here into the answer. Now 45 doesn't fit into 6, so that's why there's no box there. 45 fits into 67 just once, and that equals 45. Then when you subtract, you get 22. So now you have 22. So now you have 225 that you're dividing 45 into. So I know that if 45 is almost 50, I know that 50 can fit into 200 4 times. So maybe I pick 4 or 5 as my first guess. So I used some estimating to try to see how many times I thought it would fit, and now I have to try some work on the side. So 4 times 5 is 20, 4 times 4 is 16, plus 2 more is 18. So then we can see if maybe it'll go in again. So let's try 45 times 5. 5 times 5 is 25, 5 times 4 is 20, plus 2 more is 22. So it goes exactly 5 times. 5 times 45 is exactly 225, and then I get no remainder. So my final answer is 1 5/10. So remember, 15 or 1500ths, those are different values than 1 5/10. Your decimal has to be in the right spot. So Jerome is 1 5/10 taller than Casey. Go ahead and sharpen. Thank you for waiting. So make sure you fill in all of those blocks, all those little boxes. Now you can multiply to check your answer. So if you notice, like let's say that you're working on independent practice and you start noticing that you and your friend are getting different answers and you're not sure how you're going to check your work once your friend and you cannot help each other anymore. Multiplying to check your answer is another way. So if you take the answer, the quotient, which in this case is 1 5/10, and you multiply it by the divisor, which is the number on the outside of the bar, you should get the number on the inside of the bar because those three numbers are a fact family. So if you multiply all of these, you'll get 6 75/100ths. You can do that to check. Okay, example number 2. If we find 600ths divided by 1 5/10. Now, last lesson, the number that was a decimal always went underneath the bar, and the number that was a whole number always went outside. But now that we've got 2 decimal points, you have to know which number is which. You don't want to set this up incorrectly. So the first number, when it's written horizontally like this, the first number always goes underneath the bar and the second number goes outside the bar. So think of it like that. Like you take one and you scoot it that way, you take the other one and you scoot it that way. So they kind of switch places once they go underneath the bar. If you put them in the wrong spot, you'll get a different answer and it probably won't work out the way you think it should. Then that's where the problem will lie. Okay, right here shows you what to do with the decimal point. 1 5/10, you have to swoop it one time to get to the end of the number. So then you do the same thing to 600ths, and now you have 6/10. Bump the number up, bump the decimal point up. So the decimal was here and here. I scooted it once, and now it's up into my answer. So now 15 does not go into 0, 15 does not go into 6, but 15 goes into 60. Does anybody know how many times it will fit? Oh, do you see the red 0 there? We had to add a 0. Did you get that?
Showing us the answer.
How many times?
4.
Let's try it. 15 times 4 is 20. That's 4 plus 2 more is 6. So that would be 4 times. That equals 60. So this 0 right here, this came up last time. Do you remember when we had to annex a 0 as we were dividing? Because it didn't fit into, 15 did not fit into 0, 15 did not fit into 6, and that's technically where that number ended. We added that extra 0 that's in red there on your paper. We had to add that and we annexed that 0 so that we could continue the problem. Otherwise, you're just going to keep getting zeros. You'd get 0 remainder 6. But you can't have a remainder in a division problem. So you have to add the decimal or add the 0 after the decimal and then continue the problem. Okay? So on this one, we had to annex the 0. Again, just like it shows you right here, you can multiply the quotient by the divisor, and you should get the dividend as your answer. So check by multiplying helps if you're trying to double check an answer with someone. Yes.
Like I just looked down, it said, and I just put 0.04, but I checked it after.
Okay, make sure you check
Yeah, I checked
it. Yeah, make sure you check it. All right, so you're going to work on the guided practice question. You're going to check it with a neighbor. I'm going to give you your time to work. Please make sure that you double check those decimal points and make sure those decimal points are in the right places. That's the reason why you're going to get some of these wrong if you do. I guarantee you, because you know how to do the division problems aren't hard here. They're not super huge numbers. But it's going to be where your decimal point goes is where you're going to get messed up if you do. So please double check where your decimal point goes with your neighbor. If you guys have the same digits but the decimal's in the different spot, you should check to see who's right.